What's going on, APUSH peeps? We have key concept 9.3 of the revised edition. This is it. Congratulations. In a few minutes, you will be done with the AP curriculum and ready to destroy that test coming up. All right, before we begin, shout out time. I have to give a shout out to my two classes. It's 2 and 5. You guys are awesome. It's been a real pleasure teaching you all year. You're the best. Mr. Hope's class, Mr. Armstrong's class, Ms. Berry's class in Iowa, Mrs. Christensen's class, and Mr. Wilkersham's class in Michigan. And especially you right there listening, watching right now. I appreciate your support. Best of luck to all of you. And never forget you are more than a test score. All right, key concept 9.3 states, the end of the Cold War and the new challenges to U.S. leadership in the world forced the nation to redefine its foreign policy and global role. So some big idea questions. How did Ronald Reagan interact with the Soviet Union in the 1980s? And what led to the war on terror? And what were its impacts both domestically as well as internationally? Roman numeral 1 states the Reagan administration promoted an interventionist foreign policy that continued in later administrations, even after the end of the Cold War. So how did Reagan assert U.S. opposition to communism? Reagan was a very steadfast anti-communist leader. Well, he did so in a couple ways. He used speeches, and most famously probably was his Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. And he also called the Soviet Union an evil empire. So Ronald Reagan was a very good orator and used this to deliver the message of, and used that to try to bring about the end of the Cold War. We also have limited military interventions in the Caribbean, for example. The U.S. overthrew the government in Grenada, which was a communist-leaning government. So the U.S. is continuing that policy in Latin America of trying to stop communist governments from coming to and keeping power. And we also have the buildup of nuclear and conventional weapons, ICBMs, which stand for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. And here is an ICBM that was developed under Reagan's administration, and its nickname was the Peacemaker. You also have the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. This was Reagan's plan to build a satellite defense system in outer space that would help shoot down a nuclear missile if it were launched at the U.S. Now, this did not come to fruition, but it was a plan. So what ultimately helped contribute to the end of the Cold War? Well, we have increased U.S. military spending, as I just mentioned. You have the development of ICBMs, and the U.S. spent a lot of money building up the military under Reagan, which the Soviet Union had a hard time keeping pace with. We have Reagan's diplomatic initiatives. He had a pretty good relationship with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and the two of them worked together to help ease tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And we also have political and economic issues in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So some factors within the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, which glasnost allowed for more openness, and it was a political reform in the Soviet Union, and perestroika were economic reforms. So you see a movement away from communism and allowing some elements of capitalism. So what were the impacts of the end of the Cold War? Well, we have the new diplomatic relationships, the expansion of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created to stop the spread of communism in Europe. And NATO adds several new nations. You'll notice over here in Eastern Europe, all this blue, these are NATO nations. So NATO is expanding in Eastern Europe. Also, peacekeeping interventions, whether it was Iraq in 1991 in the first Gulf War, or bombings in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in the 1990s when a genocide was happening. And this is a theme that has continued throughout U.S. history, especially pre and post World War II. There are debates over America's role in the world, like how powerful, how involved should the U.S. be on the world stage. All right, Roman numeral 2 states following the attacks of September 11, 2001, U.S. foreign policy efforts focused on fighting terrorism around the world. So on September 11, 2001, there were attacks in Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania, and New York City. Here's a famous picture from that Tuesday morning. And Al-Qaeda led the attack on the U.S. Again, it's the World Trade Center, the two Twin Towers in New York City, the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C., and a plane crashed in Pennsylvania. So this led directly to the conflict in Afghanistan. This was a response to the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan, holding Osama bin Laden and not turning him over. And this led to a lengthy conflict. The conflict in Iraq began 2 years later in 2003, and this was a U.S.-led invasion against Saddam Hussein, and the U.S. under President George W. Bush, argued that Saddam Hussein was suspected of having weapons of mass destruction and connections to terrorism. And really, neither of those has come true in the years after the fact. There have been no WMDs discovered, but that was an argument used to go in preemptively into Iraq. So what are the impacts of the war on terrorism? Well, there's a hope to improve security in the United States, but it also raises questions about protection of civil liberties and human rights. So as far as civil liberties are concerned, we have the Patriot Act, which was passed in response to 9/11. This gives the federal government increased power to wiretap without a warrant. And there's something called a roving wiretap, which focuses on the person, not the device. So under a roving wiretap, any device could be tapped if a suspected individual could use that device. So this increases the government's ability to wiretap on individuals. And Edward Snowden has been in the news in recent years. He's used to work for the government and has released lots of classified documents that shows that the U.S. federal government is examining phone records and text messages and emails of citizens that are not suspected of terrorist connections as well. Now, there's also debates over fossil fuels and environmental impacts, and this is caused by conflict in the Middle East. And this goes back a long time, but in period 9, we have 1991, the first Gulf War. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and there's concern about the world's oil supply. So the U.S. and many other countries throughout the world stepped in to push Iraq out of Kuwait. There's concerns about climate change, and former Vice President Al Gore created a documentary called An Inconvenient Truth, which focuses on the impacts of humans on the environment. And this is a major debate today in politics between the Democrats and Republicans. However, the U.S. continued as the world's leading superpower, even in the face of economic and foreign policy challenges. All right, guys, we'll finish up with some test tips for multiple choice and short answer. Be able to identify and explain the U.S.-Soviet relations, especially with Reagan and Gorby in the late 1980s. The U.S. in the post-Cold War world, what's it like? And think about intervening. Think about still being a world superpower. For essay topics, you will not see one exclusively on period 9. Could be part of a bigger theme, such as the Cold War policy from the beginning of the Cold War to the end of the Cold War, and civil liberties as well, post-World War II to present day. And you could even see one on foreign policy from post-World War II to today, things that debates over the U.S.'s role and what remained the same and what changed. So that changing continuity theme there as well. That is it. Congratulations on completing period 9 and all key concepts in the APUSH curriculum. I thank you guys very much for watching and sticking with me throughout the year. Please make sure you check the description for period review videos in 10 minutes. And of course, my massive review videos covering the first half of the year and the second half of the year as well. And best of luck on that exam. You will do great. And I hope to see you next year in AP Gov if you're taking it. I have videos on that as well. So thank you very much. Best of luck and have a good day.